EPPAC meeting. I know we're all excited to be here. We have a lot of interesting things to talk through today. The purpose of the meeting today is to review a couple of proposed scenarios that have been put together by the utilities based on the input that's been received for the last few weeks related to scenario preferences and scenario themes. The concept here is basically to try to generate those final two scenarios of the CGPP capacity expansion modeling so that we have some nice, interesting, relevant, and also kind of boundary conditions so that we can give the commission some really good information about what the potential futures are in terms of transmission investment needs. We also have a few additional documents that have been going around. I think most of you probably saw the email around the headroom slides that the joint utilities put together. I would ask, as I did on the email, if you have feedback or questions about those slides, please send them to EPPAC email. Otherwise, we do plan on having a sit down at part of one of our meetings to have the JU walk through that headroom analysis and proposals in December, I think at that December 11th meeting. So this is not your only shot to look at those. We're going to be talking about those in more detail in the future as well. But this meeting, we're not going to be going over that in this meeting, but that is in your inboxes to review when you get the chance. With that, I was going to open up and see if anybody had any quick questions before we dive into the joint utilities presentation of a couple proposed scenarios.
Skylar, I had one that maybe will transition us nicely into this scenario conversation, building on some questions that I think have come up over the last couple EPPAC sessions. And maybe this is a question for NYSO, if we have anyone from the organization on the phone. But particularly early, given NYSO is going to be doing the modeling work here, there may be a resourcing question related to NYSO's bandwidth and what NYSO considers a scenario versus a sensitivity. I imagine as we go through here, we might want to call different things scenarios, or folks might be interested in sensitivity. So just understanding what the bandwidth is there and what we should plan for before we dive into the scenarios might be helpful.
Sarah or Jason, did you want to say anything on that now?
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Karkner from the NYSO, so I can speak to that. So I'll say we're going through the process now, coordinating closely with the state agencies to try to determine what the bandwidth is and what the headcount that we'll need to support the CGPP process. So I'll say that is ongoing, and we are committed to having staff available to perform the analysis needed for CGPP. And in terms of the scenario versus sensitivity, I would say that generally speaking, we view a sensitivity as a one-off assumption change from what the main scenario would be to assess what the impact of that specific assumption is, and that a scenario would comprise, a multitude of assumptions, that may vary between scenarios, for instance. I hope that helps answer the question. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. And Tom, was that a good setup? I know we can probably take this on kind of in context one at a time if this type of a question does come up in the development of the scenarios about whether something should, influence the whole scenario or if we should try to save stuff for individual sensitivities. But did you have anything else you want to follow up on with that answer?
No, I think that helps. So I guess just to make sure I understood it correctly is the NYSO is working through exactly what resources are going to be required now, and maybe even these conversations might help inform that. But hopefully in the next coming weeks and months, we'll have a clearer picture on exactly what NYSO is able to support. But I think that answered my question.
And yes, I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, great. Were there any other questions from the EPPAC members before we jump into the presentation? All right, so I'm going to hand it over to the JU. I was thinking, since we're all kind of seeing this for the first time, it would probably be good to give maybe 5 or 10 minutes or so to let the initial kind of presentation play out, at least to present, what's been done and why. And then we can do the usual, raising hands, queuing some questions when we jump into the more granular analysis. But I think we should all probably let the initial phase of the presentation go and then jump in with questions. Does that sound good, everybody? Excellent. All right, so I think I'm going to hand it over to Tom. Is that right, to walk through some of this?
Yeah. So hopefully the
Awesome.
screen share goes well. Let me know if and when you can see this, hopefully on Microsoft Excel sheet.
Yep, I see it.
Excellent. So yes, presentation is maybe giving us a little more credit than it's due. We're sort of figuring this out live with all of you, which I think is sort of the point here. We're excited about it, but this is a preliminary set of assumptions that the joint utilities put together as a starting point to talk about scenarios 2 and 3, and of course, after aligning hopefully today on some of these higher level assumptions, we can really dig into the matrices that NISO will need to go variable by variable and make sure that we have the right scenario assumptions laid out. But this is directionally making sure that we have the right scenario overviews and high level assumptions. Just to lay out exactly what the joint utilities goals were in setting out these scenarios, I think, Skylar, you hit on a few of them, but I'll reiterate, is we want to be able to test divergent cases. So if we have the choice between modifying a variable that we think will lead to a divergent build out versus one that will lead to a fairly similar one, we'll tend to lean towards the former, just to make sure that our conclusions are easy to compare. But that said, the most important consideration here is that our assumptions are reasonable, that they're possible future scenarios, and we're not just tweaking assumptions for the sake of putting our hands on the lever to move transmission one way or another, or generation one way or another. So the assumptions and variation among the assumptions are meant to be meaningful. I would say the next item that we considered heavily is EPPAC input. Specifically, you'll see on this sheet that we worked on to come up with this. We have all of your input built in here into one of the tabs. We talked through each of the preferred options and definitely aligned with the summary of the EPPAC output, I think, in terms of what we landed on for assumption changes, but that was a very important input for us. And then lastly, we tried our best to focus on high impact variations. So we, of course, want to be able to drive variation in the results, like we talked about in the first element, but a countervailing interest would be the interest in limiting the number of variables we modify, because the more variables you modify, the more difficult it is to interpret results and what's driving the differences among results. So if we can pick those highest impact variables and focus our energy around those, we can sort of hit all of these goals, all 4 of those stated goals at once. And I think that's what we've achieved here. So with that context in mind, I'll sort of walk through these cases. I think I'll go through the load conditions for both of them, and then the generation conditions for both of them. And then, like Skylar said, as folks are digesting, we can come back and go through line by line with as much details as desired to get under the hood here. But there should be an appreciation that this is, again, high level direction. The next meetings, I think, are the ones where we're going to have the ability to get into the NISO matrices and talk about megawatts of this technology versus that and specific marginal costs. This is just directional. So I'll pause. Well, actually, we're going to do questions later. Apologies. I won't pause. I'll keep talking. All right. So scenario 2 and 3, we're not great at naming scenarios, so we're open to input here, but pretty straightforward, right? One that that includes variables that we tweaked in a way that we imagine will reduce the impact on the transmission system in the interest of that first goal that we stated. And then on the other side, we aligned with assumptions that we think are reasonable that will tend to, in combination, drive more of a build out, right? Just to get at that divergence. When we talk about load, this is the single most important variable by a good margin on this page. It is both the most outcome determinative in that peak and energy considerations will drive the generation and transmission build out. But also really important because there's a huge reasonable range of future realities, right? Load in particular, looking at things like electrification of transport and heat, we could see a lot of different divergent futures, particularly when you look at 2030 and 2040 as we look at different adoption curves for technology. So this is, if there's an area you're asking for the GOU's expertise on which area is the most important to focus on to get meaningful results, this is the one. Now, something I want to caveat is we did some bundling here. So we heard through the EPPAC that the most important variables are, or some important variables to consider would be a lower load scenario, scenarios where adoption of different electrification technologies are a little lighter. But we also heard mentions of increased adoption of distributed energy resources, maybe increased adoption of flexible distributed energy resources or storage. And really what that means to us is DER that's used to mitigate load that would otherwise cause transmission issues, right? Flexible in the sense that it's being used to mitigate planning needs. So a simplifying assumption here, particularly for the low case, is that we can achieve the same effect of adding in flexible DER through reductions in load. And given this, the way that this capacity expansion model is set up, those should have similar impacts, particularly in terms of ease of implementation, avoiding building out a ton of extra DER and specifically modeling it to buses with specific curves will be low-hanging fruit here. We can achieve a similar impact on the model through just modifying the load downward. So you'll see here in scenario 2, row 5, we have that exactly here. Use a lower load assumption, which aligns with those two types of asks. One thing that I will say is going to be important for load is that we try to align around existing models or at least existing forecasts, because rebuilding a custom load forecast is probably not within the schedule in terms of the amount of effort it would be. That said, if it's taking a pre-built scenario and making some simple programmatic tweaks to it, that might be feasible. But in general, aligning around existing loading outputs that make sense in the context of our New York forecast is going to be important for both the high and the low case here around load. So that's the low case for load. Like I said, we're thinking that reducing load can have a similar impact as reducing DER. And we have some options here, like, for example, utilizing the NYISO low load case. But again, that's a detailed conversation for later, just something to start thinking about. On the high transmission impact side for load, we do believe that there's a need to use a higher load, right? Makes sense, lower load in the low case, higher load in the high case. This is where what load shape we utilize becomes more important. So one thing that I want to mention as we go through this, and you'll see this in more detail when we get to the NYISO's assumption matrices and how we fill those out, is that the NYISO assumptions in some cases vary a good bit from the way that the state model is modeling things. So for example, if you see throughout here, same as state scenario, that is indicative not that the NYISO is not changing any of the models from what they're doing in the SRO, but instead that they are probably changing one of their scenario parameters to align with what's being done in the state scenario. And we think that that's important to allow us to do apples to apples comparisons among these, because there are quite a bit of the smaller level variables, like I said, that we'll talk about in the next couple of weeks, that vary quite a bit from the state scenario versus the NYISO scenarios. The reason I mention that with context to the high load here is because, in fact, the state scenario loading, what we are using for policy case 1 in the outlook, as well as our case 1 here, is actually not too far off. It's closer to the NYISO high load scenario than it is the NYISO low load scenario. So a long way of saying there might be reason to look at the NYISO high load scenario as one of the pre-built forecasts here, but there also is good reason to look at something like a CAC case, maybe a better reason to look at something like a CAC case to drive some of that divergence. But again, detail for next session. All right, that's the high level load. I think it's pretty straightforward when it boils down to it. I said a lot of words to say we're going to pick a set of loading assumptions that align with a high electrification, lower DER future, and on the other end of the spectrum, the opposite, a lower load, lower electrification, higher flexible DER type of option that will reduce in, or will result in reduced peak load and energy consumption at the distribution buses. Skylar, want me to pause there and talk anything about load or keep plowing through generation?
I think that was great. I think this type of setup is working really well. If you want to just maybe go through the other main ones that you think build out the scenarios, and then we can start taking questions.
Excellent. Okay, so hopefully I'll do less talking down here because, like I said, the load is really the most important variable for driving results here, and the one that we are going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about. As you see down here in the generation section, like I had sort of set up earlier, a lot of these are going to be same as state scenario. Again, that is driving a difference from the NISO cases, so we're not going to see exactly the same thing. We don't expect to see very similar results from what NISO's high and low load cases would result in through the outlook. But there were a couple variables here that we felt were worth tweaking just to further differentiate these cases based on reasonable futures. So in general, without going line by line, I'll say in the low case on the left side here, the generation features that we're thinking of modifying are minimal. Really, the only two that I think are boiling to the top is one related to generation retirement. So this is a little bit of a nuance, but the way that the ISO and the way that the state model considers generation retirement is slightly different. So this would be a shift to look at primarily age-based retirement, but with a focus on longer retirement ages, right? Maybe these generators are outliving their forecasted ages by 10, 20 years on the gas generation side, and that's a change in a variable that will tend to reduce the need for transmission and generation. That said, of course, by 2040, we are not burning any gas. This is still compliant with all the CLCPA mandates, but to note in between that, the way that the generation retires could have an impact on what happens in the in-between years. Likewise, on the high impact side, we basically stated the opposite, right? Keep it with age-based retirements, but maybe assume that generators are retiring on the younger end, gas generators specifically, as opposed to on the older age spectrum. Seems straightforward, but could have a decently meaningful impact. On the low side, the only other generation parameter that we looked at modifying is storage cost. We thought that you could modify all of the renewable generation nameplate marginal capacity or fixed ongoing costs, but it would sort of be randomly choosing some, and the outcome in terms of high impact, low impact, increased reduction in build out was hard to foresee. For that reason, we chose to focus on defers and storage. So we just talked about defers, and for storage, really, we're thinking of reducing the nameplate capacity marginal cost on the low transmission impact side, because we believe that this will have open up the ability for storage to meet market needs as well as be utilized as a transmission asset potentially, but at least have more flexible storage resources plugged throughout, which might have a downward effect on transmission. Moving back to the high transmission impact, we're almost done here. The only things other than what I talked about for generation retirement is probably the highest impact. It would be modifying the way that we looked at defers. We talked about quite a few different ways to impact defer build out in a way that's appropriate for this high case. Starting with cost, we could affect the upfront cost or the fuel cost, i.e. the hydrogen cost. But really, instead of modifying costs and just potentially increasing the cost of any solution or build out, we thought that a more appropriate way to do this might be through resource potential. And the way that we would effectuate that is telling the model when it can start building defers. For example, maybe in the state scenario, it's by 2031, and in the high case, it's by 2035 or 2036, something like that. And potentially limiting the amount that can be built out per year to be a more realistic figure. This is an important one to think about because you could have a model that's unsolvable when you limit the ability to utilize defers. So we might need to affect other parameters to make sure we're getting models that solve in a meaningful way. But defer, nonetheless, a high impact variable on the generation side that definitely will affect the need for transmission. The only other one mentioned here, the last thing I will mention is potentially an option for the high transmission impact in 2030, where instead of utilizing 6 gigawatts of storage, which is what's currently in the state model, by 2030. We might look at a 3 gigawatts by 2030, given that's not a firm mandate, and happens to align with what the NICE already has modeled. All right, that was a whole lot. So maybe before I open this up for questions, I'll ask if folks on the joint utility side want to jump in and if I mischaracterized anything or add a little bit of detail here or there, because that was quite a bit. And then maybe Skylar, if there's nothing else from the JU, I'll hand it back to you to solicit some input.
Okay, if there's no other clarifying points from the JU, I'll give it another 10 seconds for any JU folks who might have been shy, but then we'll jump into questions. All right, so I see 3 hands up. Chris, I see your hand first. You want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Skylar. Hey, Tom, just real quick, kind of reinforcing a point that you made, and that is if you more aggressively retire existing units, coupled with load growth potential from electrification, and limit the deeper build out, to your point, you could end up with an outcome that just is not solvable. And that would be it's more a statement than anything else.
No, that's a fair statement. I don't know if there's anyone, Jeff or Chris or others on the J side who want to talk. We did talk a little bit about mitigation techniques, increasing the flexibility of other intermittent resources to maybe help the model solve here and there. But that's something we are definitely thinking about.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and that's one that's kind of hard to know ahead of time, exactly what level and what assumptions are going to, necessarily create an unsolvable solution in the model. It's something we'll probably have to learn as we go. But the key here is like trying to have the best available information and try to use that information to create 3 scenarios that we think are possible futures, that will, be able to run through the modeling framework here and create 3 scenarios for transmission build-outs. But that's definitely something good to keep in mind if we think something is completely infeasible for some reason or results in unsolvability in the model. We'll have to adjust that as we go. I see Raya's hand next.
Hi, yes, thank you. I've got, I guess, 2 comments. One, I guess it's a concern, this low transmission, like this lower load scenario. I just, how I realize you're talking about putting some things together and using some of NISO's lower load forecast. My question is on that, where is that coming from? It's just at least through the scoping plan process, I think there's an anticipation of there being higher load. So I guess my question is, where is this lower load coming from, and what is it really going to tell us? I'm a little unsure about where this is coming from vis-a-vis, the analyses that have already been done by the state and the NISO. And then my second question, getting to or comment or question really about this solvability of limiting DFERs. I mean, one reason that we need to limit the DFERs is because, technologically and expense-wise, we know they can't solve the problem. So how will those, limitations in terms of, feasibility and cost, be reflected, or how are they reflected? Just today, one of the big NYC compost to heating fuel project just went offline. Like, some of these things can't be done despite the money that's on the table to try and do them. So those are my two questions. One, what's up with the lower load in terms of reality and how that's going to be represented vis-a-vis what the state and NISO have already done? And then 2, what is, I know we're trying to solve this model with DFERs, but how is this model looking at the actual technological and financial limitations?
I'll take an attempt on the first part of the question there around load, and I might need a little bit of help on the back end around describing defer modeling. But in terms of load, I'll point back to the goals that we started out here with is one to try and test conditions that will lead to different results as opposed to the same.
Yeah.
And then importantly, ensuring that we're looking at reasonable alternative futures. So it's probably a misnomer to call it low load. That's fair. It's probably low relative load. I think we would be looking at scenarios where under all three of these scenarios, load is going to grow for sure. And I would say in all of them above probably historic rates even, but it's a matter of degrees. So low load, absolutely a good option might be some of the Climate Action Council scenarios that focus on that, relatively lower load, less of the decarbonization, but still striving towards the state goals.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go, Tom. Lower load probably does need to be clarified. It's slightly lower than the very high load we expect in the future, because it's still supposed to be consistent with those, the electrification being a kind of a central component of decarbonization. But there were a couple of scenarios and sensitivities in the CAC work that kind of maximized flexibility and DER. That still kind of hit that, it's still the amount of energy, the actual, annual load is higher, peak is still higher. It's just trying to manage that peak and that impact to kind of, you serve as a lower transmission impact scenario in a potential future. And on the second point, I definitely hear what you're saying about, today there's a lot of technologies that have been on the table as quote unquote defers that are probably out of the money today and are not necessarily commercially available. And even the ones that are, being funded as demonstrations don't always pan out. So we definitely hear that. And I think that's one of the things that had driven, the NISO modeling to use just a generic kind of service-based resource in their model and not necessarily specify what specifically is providing those services. The issue obviously is coming up with limitations, and those are in twofold, either cost limitations of what the model is seeing in terms of the cost of accessing that asset, because if the cost is too low, it'll just build it everywhere without knowing what it actually is, right? So that needs to be managed. And then second, as Tom mentioned here, on one of the options is, limiting the actual build rate, because that's another thing models can get pretty aggressive with, building 3, 5, 10 gigawatts of something that it thinks it needs for reliability because it's there, it's available in the model, and the model sees that it can just unlimited build. And if there are, those technology or cost concerns, that's something we would want to represent somehow in one of the scenarios at the very least, if not, just a sensitivity to make sure we are showing what would happen if there is a very limited availability of this, or if we need to rely on, certain other technologies instead of some of the technologies on the table as defers today.
All right, thank you very much.
See Julia's hand next.
Hi, yeah, this is Julia Casagrande from the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. I think I have a comment question that's kind of similar to Raya's, so and I think half of it was already answered, but I'll elaborate a little bit. I'm thinking I see why we would do high and low a bit. I see why we would want to have the high with the bounds of the maybe worst case scenario. But I do wonder if the low, and as you said, maybe low is the wrong word, and maybe it could be more of a managed impact. If that could be more of the ideal scenario, I'm just thinking from we, do policy development, and if there was something that was ideal to strive for, it might be helpful to look to, for example, a lot of the things, some of the things in there are more optimistic, like the low storage cost, but we would want, high electrification and high energy efficiency. So just a thought, if one of the scenarios could be more targeted toward ideal or optimal transmission impact.
I hear what you're saying, to try to create what would be the optimal decarbonization if everything kind of fell correctly. I hear the desire for sure to do that. Anyone for the JU, did you want to kind of discuss how, the different quote unquote optimals of kind of best electrification, best things, whether that might pan out to give us the bounds we need? One of the things that I was thinking about when we're kind of describing what we need to do in creating scenarios 2 and 3 was this type of bounding analysis. Because of the whole, being very early on, this is the first cycle in CGPP, wanting to know what those boundaries look like. Because some of these things, like storage costs, for example, we don't really control outside of, aggressive state programming. And so knowing where those boundaries are at this early stage was kind of one of the priorities that we had kind of laid out. But I also hear, that desire to try to look at, what if we created an ideal scenario for all these assumptions? What would that look like?
So I might answer that with a question at first. When you say ideal or optimal, that's what this model really is doing, right? Is capacity expansion is optimizing on cost to lay out generation and transmission resources, and the load as an input. I suppose is the ask if the model would also optimize load, like we'd let it tell us. I think that might be a little bit outside of scope, or is the ask something slightly different?
I'm thinking less in the model telling us what would be optimal. And I guess I should note that like we might not all agree within this group of what the best case scenarios would be, but I'm thinking like if we chose, for example, high electrification, which I think we generally agree would be like a beneficial thing, and then we chose low energy cost storage, like we took the best decarbonization possibilities and put that into the model, and then it would optimize based on cost. Just thinking like if I'm looking at it, I could see that case as being the inputs or the situations that we would strive for, try to move the market towards as we're, creating policy and programs and such.
Can I just, it's Liz at DPS, and Julia, I want to sort of respond to that. And we're not doing this modeling to develop programs and policies. We're doing this modeling to give the Public Service Commission some reasonably educated guesses about how much ratepayer money to invest in transmission to get as close as possible to our goals. So I think if we had I'm not a modeler myself, so Skylar, please correct me, but I think if at some point, if you do a very, very rosy scenario, you're not giving the commission very useful information, because what we want are sort of reasonable takes on what the future might look like. I don't think we can assume that everything will fall in place perfectly or exactly as we might wish it to. I think we have to have a slightly less than rosy, but not too gloomy scenarios, if you see what I mean.
That's fair.
And hopefully, when we have these 3 scenario build outs, if we have a low case, a generally central case and a higher case, one of the really interesting takeaways is hopefully going to be how do those impact the transmission build out? There's a few different permutations of how that could pan out. We could see exponential increase in transmission needs from scenario to scenario, and that would be a really, really important finding about how sensitive transmission needs are to the different scenarios. We could also find the opposite about basically doing this massive energy transition. No matter what the scenario is, all 3 require either very little or very, a high level of transmission build out. We need to kind of at this early stage, and this might change in future CGPP cycles, but one of the preferences we had at this early stage is to do what Liz says, is kind of have those boundary conditions that are still all feasible, but give us kind of the lay of the land about what transmission needs are in each scenario and how they compare to each other. But definitely keep your thoughts in mind about what is ideal in each scenario and how those preferences might be spread out across these different scenarios, and see if they're being represented, accurately how you'd like them to be represented too. That's still very important. Okay, I see. Randy?
Yes, hey, hey Skylar, how are you? So I'm speaking on behalf of the offshore wind resources. I work at Vineyard Offshore. I've got, I really just got really two sort of comments, and I'm not sure how those are going to get incorporated. But one is generation. So we know that offshore wind currently the awarded projects are a little over 8.3 gigawatts. And we also have a PPTN that's coming along, the New York PPTN, which allows for an additional 4.7-ish to 8 gigawatts to connect into the NISO system. So based on that, are you guys still sticking with what's in the CLCPA, or are you going to be looking at the additional above 9 scenarios? So 9 plus the 4.7 or 5 rounded off, or 9 plus the 8 in addition, based on what's happening with the PPTN. So that's like one part of my question. And then the other one, I guess my comment is really based out on transmission itself. So of course you've got the two PPTNs that are happening specifically for offshore wind. You've got the LI PPTN, which I believe is, as last I recall with my conversation with NISO, that was not in the case yet. So I think it's important that since that's been awarded, it should be in the case. And then the other one is the hub, the New York City PPTN. That's out. It's out for solicitation, and I think it's important that that also is incorporated somehow in at least one or a scenario, because there is a high chance that it also gets awarded. So those are like two sort of things I think that need to be accounted for when it comes to like the system representation, because those will have an impact. And I guess the third, if I've got an opportunity, is also a lot of our internal studies have shown that under low load scenarios, we're actually normally the interfaces, the power generally flows from like north to south, generally in the NISO system. But we're finding that under low load scenarios, it's started to push the other way because of the amount of offshore wind that's coming into the south of the state. So we're finding that some of those HVDC links are getting constrained. So the CHPE and CPNY, those tend to bring power in, but they are certainly bi-directional. So how much are we considering that in these scenarios? I guess those are really three of my comments.
So I saw Liz's hand go up. So I was going to say one thing about, just to answer the first part of your first question, then turn it over to Liz to talk more about the PPTN stuff. But in terms of what's represented in the model for offshore wind availability, the 9 gigawatt goal is a firm build. It's a requirement in the model that, so the model sees that as a constraint to get built by then, and the award projects are firm builds within the model, and then the model gets to choose how it's to hit that 9 gigawatts, but it's not a cap. The model could also move beyond 9 gigawatts if it sees fit, based on the costs and the loads and all that stuff. So there's no like limit built in on the offshore wind builds. But I'm going to turn over to Liz to talk through the rest of it.
Okay,
Yeah,
great. Thanks, Shiloh.
And we don't need to take up time here. You could feel free to reach out to me, but the New York City PPTN is not in addition to 8 gigawatts of awards. The Long Island and the New York City PPTNs are designed to provide infrastructure to support the 9 gigawatt goal, not more than the 9 gigawatt goal. And feel free to reach out to me and I can explain.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Liz.
In terms of the power flows, I definitely hear that. That's something we are curious about. That'll be something to watch as we go through these scenarios. Especially if we do have a much lower demand scenario, if that 9 gigawatts of offshore wind does some interesting things in terms of power flows down the state, that's something we will hopefully learn through this process as well. So that's something to keep an eye on and keep talking about. Bill, I think, was next.
Yeah, thanks, Skylar. Bill Ackroyd, New York Best. Like to ask a question. Actually, I have two questions. One with regard to the low load scenario. And I guess I appreciate the kind of modeling simplification of viewing low load, viewing high load, high DER, high local energy storage, high load flexibility together as low load. I think it might have a marketing branding problem, which you just saw in the discussion that Julie was having and Ryan might be having. That I think as we look at this, we're not attempting to achieve to slow down electrification. We're looking at ways to actually achieve that high electrification with a lower load impact on the transmission system through local assets. And so I'm not sure if that simplification is really what you want to have as the scenario. We may want to have that scenario be a high local asset, high flexibility, high energy storage scenario that achieves the effect of low load on the transmission system without actually calling it low load scenario. And I'm also, I guess the question, Tom, in that is are there any differences that you view actually modeling the scenarios? Because I guess I could see there might be some, and I wanted to make sure we dove into that, because what I wouldn't want to have happen is I wouldn't want to have us back ourselves into an artificial low load scenario because we think it's a surrogate for the scenario we're really envisioning, which is the high DER, high local resource scenario. So I'll ask that question first, and I have a question on the second scenario.
I think that's a fair challenge. So first, I think I'm happy to solicit some help from EPPAC here over the next couple sessions. We definitely need better names for our scenarios. Low load won't be a good one to stick with. You're right; it doesn't hit the policy in it. Maybe it's load growth, accelerated growth, and policy achievement growth, or something like that. But to your point on differentiating DER growth versus reduced load, I think our thought was that when you talk about flexible DER and you talk about model impacts, especially understanding we're just looking at certain time slices of the year for most of this, you're going to be looking at essentially, in terms of transmission impact, a peak load reduction is the biggest bang for your buck. And to your point, that's whether you have a peak load reduction through a reduction in, let's say in a winter heating system, a reduction in the amount of electric heating that you install versus having a ton of distributed solar that's mitigating the electric heating at the right time in the winter. What it looks like at the buses that are modeled, especially for those time slices that are being modeled, is pretty similar, especially when you think of the impact that we're focused on here, which is transmission impact. I'll further say, I'm sure there are slight differentiations between doing what I'm suggesting versus actually modeling in all the load and generation separately. And I'll see if there's anyone on our side that's a little more technically savvy that can help folks appreciate why this is such a challenge. But my understanding is really when you get to modeling these things in these large systems, especially since we're treating distribution as an input, you almost have to rebuild everything at every bus to be able to effectively modify DER, particularly when you're saying flexible DER. That implies that it's like acting differently than it is today, and we're changing hourly, hour by hour forecast. That can be a huge amount of labor for what we sort of thought was a diminishing return there, given they scratch the same itches. But I'll pause if there's anyone else that has thoughts on why it's a little less important to modify DER when in the low scenario, the low impact scenario we're looking at.
Well, since we didn't have people jump in, Tom, my second part of that question, actually, second part to that one, and then the one on the other scenario. Second part to that one is, and I do think we should view it as a higher DER scenario, and the question is really how much higher. We pointed out when we proposed the higher DER, higher local energy storage scenario and flexible load scenario, that the returns probably aren't linear with that, in the sense that if you add DERs to effectively reduce the load, there are levels at which you suddenly offset the need for some transmission, and then another threshold where you suddenly offset more need as opposed to a linear benefit. So how much we add in the scenario becomes really, really important. What's your thinking on that? Is there some preliminary assessments that might be done to find these some ideas of the thresholds I'm talking about?
Coming from the distribution side, I know that that is a big challenge given how much is out there, right? Like our hosting capacity maps and things like that start to get at the answering the questions that you're asking in terms of localized support and piecewise solutions that are sort of step functions as opposed to these nice linear ones that us modelers like to try and model. I don't believe that we're going to have a comprehensive enough analysis here to be able to, and again, I actually think this is a little bit gaming, so I don't know that we'd want to unless there's a program that gives us reason to believe that this is true. But I would want to be hesitant to just sort of pick all the areas where we as planners know that distributed flexible generation would mitigate needs, and then just go ahead and assume that it's going to operate in a way that does mitigate those needs, and say that transmission is going away. To Skylar's point, that kind of is a little bit far away from what we're looking here, especially since we don't have programs today that do a good job of giving us confidence that that will be how the future actually looks. But I'm open to others' thoughts on that.
I mean, it strikes me that what we're trying to learn from that scenario is exactly that question of, if we do what we're talking about here with regard to having a substantial effect on local load, will we have a significant enough effect on the transmission costs to make it worth doing that? And so I think it's very important that we do have some assessment of the levels we're envisioning there, because it could very well be that you do a 10% difference in load and you make no difference at all, but you do a 20% and all of a sudden you have a much bigger effect than just 20%. And I'm making up numbers here, obviously. This is something that has to be studied, but it's something that we're very interested in, and I think it could be a lower cost scenario if things pan out that way. My other question, though, jumping to the other the scenario for a second, I do share the concern that was raised that if we just say we're going to minimize defers, that we may have an unsolvable situation. We believe at our best that long duration storage is potentially an important solution to offset the needs for some of the full infinite duration defers. And so one thing that we might want to consider is in the offsetting of defers to invoke more long duration storage in the model. I also would suggest that we don't try to reduce the amount of general storage if we're trying to eliminate defers. Going from 6 to 3 gigawatts is probably not helpful in trying to eliminate them. So I think we might have conflicting goals if the model is trying to reduce that. So just two thoughts on that on the second scenario you proposed.
So on this,
yeah.
Please
Go ahead, Dom.
I was just going to add that on that second piece for the 3 versus 6 gigawatt, I imagine won't have a big impact. Your comment's fair. It's important to note that's a 2030. The model would go back to building whatever it wanted for 2040, which is where defer really becomes a big challenge for the model in terms of cost.
Yeah, and just to clarify about the long duration storage, I'm not sure we really have a satisfactory answer there in terms of the capacity expansion model, how it's representing long duration storage. I think the longest we have in there is 8-hour duration, and a lot of the stuff that's been done in the past has really been with post processing, and so that might be something to test somehow in the intervening stages if we're able to do some post processing of our initial scenarios outside the model to figure out how that might impact the defer or transmission build out. We'll have to discuss, how we might be able to integrate long duration storage a little bit better in here. I had a couple things come into the chat, I think, while the past couple speakers were talking, that I wanted to go over quick. One was Sarah's response that Long Island PPTN will be in the capacity expansion model, but that the New York City PPTN may not be because it's still under evaluation. John, did you have something else to say about that?
Yeah, this is John Burdicker with NYSERDA. I just wanted to clarify, right? So if we look at the requirements of the New York City PPTN, it is, as Liz noted, supporting the achievement of the 9 gigawatt goal. And so from a capacity expansion model perspective, representing it or not is inconsequential because it's not really, the need is not requiring a change in transfer capability across the system, but really the ability to support the injection of offshore wind into New York City specifically. That's a little different from the Long Island PPTN, which specifically required some increased transfer capability, and so could have an impact on the capacity expansion model. When we get into the stages of analysis that involve nodal representations, then it will become more important to have some sort of representation, and that is something that DPS and NYSERDA are discussing. How to tackle that when we get to that point, but that's really something we would be looking at in the late first quarter, early second quarter of next year. So again, from this stage of analysis, representing the 9 gigawatt goal, as Liz noted, and allowing the model to build beyond that, as Skylar noted, is entirely sufficient. From the perspective of the New York City offshore wind PPTN.
Thanks, John. And then there was one more question in the chat related to something we talked about briefly. It says, based on the comments, how is CPNY model? Yeah, I think there was a reference to it being bidirectional. Is that something that someone from the NYSO might be able to answer in terms of how that's represented in the capacity expansion?
The Clean Path New York HVDC project is modeled as unidirectional as per its interconnection request.
Thanks, Skylar and Jason.
Great. Thanks for the question. Okay, well, I think I see one more hand up.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you so much for presenting those scenarios. I have maybe a couple of questions and comments. One on the simplification of DER in this low transmission scenario. I do have a concern based on the kind of like the scale, the magnitude of DER added. Sometimes we see that even today. This plays out even today, that when DER it starts to eat up the headroom at the local level. So I do have a question, how will this be considered based on the DER expansion in each zone or a subzone? Are the utilities thinking about that too? Because not all the DER will be absorbed at the distribution level and some flows will be on the local level.
So I'm getting out to the end of my skis, so others feel free to help me if I misstep or don't take a step far enough. But the DER is essentially being modeled as an input. We are ensuring to at least hit the well, I shouldn't say at least. We are going to hit the state mandated levels, and it's really the challenge for us is just a matter of disaggregating those zonal levels down to nodal levels, which we anticipate to do using our distribution load forecasts, which take into account sort of the local stations. Like, for example, I know you're probably concerned with like the central north area, and there's some pockets that have tons of DG and some that have absolutely none. In terms of geospatial diversity, our goal is to align with our distribution forecasts, which do a pretty good job of lumping it in areas where there's land and avoiding it in areas where there's not, and should reflect an impact on our transmission modeling. Now, I just scratched the surface. Did I miss anything, or there's anything to add on that?
So what you are saying, Tom, is that you will still be representing this new DG, DER in the nodal models? You'll still be representing them, or you will be reducing the load in some of those areas, but reducing it based on your DER expectations from this other DER tool?
I see the clarification. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, the answer is, to clarify, we don't anticipate modifying DER levels among the scenarios. So they would all have similar, the megawatts implemented would be similar across the scenarios. And the only way we would effectuate local load would be through turning the load up or down, or at least that was my suggestion. I know we have some things to take back that Bill mentioned. So there would still be DER throughout the system, and it would be modeled at levels in alignment with CLCPA, but we're just not varying those levels among the cases, if that makes sense.
And maybe just to clarify, like my concern would be in those areas where you may have a lot of DER, if they are not modeled, and you are simply like there might be surplus flows from this DG on the local level. So we would be concerned about a situation where in one particular area you have both DG and renewable scale, utility scale renewables, and you would not be showing those extra flows from DG. Therefore, you may not see, the local system overloaded, when in reality it may be because you have both large scale and DG.
Tom, does the representation in at least the capacity expansion model, in that representation, having DER basically showing up as a load modifier, does that take care of some of this where the capacity expansion model will be seeing the lower amounts of load, and so it's kind of doesn't even matter what the headroom numbers are necessarily, obviously unless they're lower and they're binding, but it doesn't matter as much because the model will not build new generation because the load's just lower, or are there additional interactions we need to think about here?
I think the complexity is coming in around things like backflow, which is particularly challenging given we're doing the time slices. So this is where I'm thoroughly out beyond my skis on the backflow issue, but I do know it's a concern that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I certainly know it's a concern in real life, with there's only a certain amount of load in a certain area, and if it's being met already with DERs, or if the DER flows in a certain area or are filling up substation, you can't necessarily inject any more renewable energy into that substation. So anyone else from the JU or the NISO have any thoughts on this? Definitely sounds like something we need to take back and discuss, if we're going to be integrating large amounts of DER and augmenting the load, especially in that one scenario, we'll definitely need to take that back and look into what other interactions might be going on there.
Skylar, I think that would be appreciated because that's the concern of maybe having pockets of DG that kind of like they may be causing backflows, and that will not be seen if you simply reduce the load. You add them as load modifiers.
Okay.
And then the other comment I have, maybe a general comment or two general comments. And I know, I think Bill also mentioned this, and maybe Raya as well. Like, it'll be helpful to show like what is even higher level, kind of like the range of demand expectations you are considering using across all scenarios and how that compares against New York ISO scenarios, just to get a better sense of how, you know, scenario 2 would fit, or like where it is on that range of scenarios. And I'm saying that also because of also because one question I have is like, are those scenarios deemed equally, have equal weight in the process? Is that how you are looking at them? Or are those more like you have the state scenario and then you have 2 additional supplementary scenarios? How do you think about those scenarios? Do they have equal weight? Or one concern with showing dramatically different assumptions across this range of scenarios is that the results of the analysis may also be drastically different. Maybe one shows no need for transmission, maybe one shows very large need of transmission. And then so it's like, what would be the recommended outcome if you have something so drastic among the scenarios studied?
Sure. I can take a first shot at that, just based on, you know, the scenario development and how we're looking at that, and then I'll turn over to you, Tom, if you have any other thoughts. When we're designing the scenarios, we don't necessarily want them to be, you know, as you're describing, like a 1% scenario and a 99% scenario, and then a scenario that seems reasonable. That those bounds, for me, that sounds, you know, too wide at this stage. We don't want to just absolutely minimize, you know, transmission and absolutely maximize it. In general, we're trying to develop, you know, 3 possible worlds, and seeing what the transmission builds are there, giving some preference to, you know, bundling realistic assumptions that create low transmission impact, and then bundling assumptions that create higher transmission impact. So in that regard, you know, we're trying to not necessarily do the maximum bounding, but you know, realistic bounding in that way. And so when we're talking about how is this going to be viewed at the end, are we going to say, well, 75% of the value is being given to the central scenario, and then we'll kind of mix in if there's any fun things from the boundary scenarios? That's not really how we're looking at it. We're looking at it as this package of 3 scenarios that are helping us evaluate what are the possible worlds and what are the possible transmission build-outs given the variation in realistic outcomes, and using that to inform, you know, current levels of investments that should be required and future levels of analysis that might be needed to clarify which of the scenarios we might end up being closer to, which one might be preferable, and those types of things. So hopefully that's helpful.
I was just going to add on your first question about different loading levels and understanding the impact. That's actually a good question, something we had to take back. I won't speak for NYSO's cases, but just point to resources they have. The Gold Book had a nice table that really helped us understand the different load forecasts, and that side by side with their policy reference cases for CEM explanation sort of helped us understand how this compares to the state model versus the 3 forecasts they developed in their Gold Book.
That's definitely the type of information we'll be getting into, you know, next time and over the next couple of meetings when we get into, you know, what if we're agreed that this does make sense, that, you know, with some clarifications that you know, Bill had brought up about what it really means, and what Raya had said about what it really means to be quote unquote lower load. If we think these are themes that are responsive to the proposals that are most interesting and we think are most important to test, that's when we, you know, we give thumbs up and we go and we try to pick the actual numbers and the actual data sets, and then we'll talk about those over the next couple of meetings as well.
Thank you. And one last comment on the headroom, and I know we'll have a meeting dedicated to the headroom analysis over the next 2 EPPAC meetings. But one comment here on that option, consider increased cost of new headroom, encouraging use of existing first. I assume there will be some sort of, in general for the headroom, there will be some sort of cross-reference too with the queue, for instance, because one extreme implication of applying something like this would be that you may assume a generator is going to be developed at that substation in that area, but it's actually unfeasible from a, call it, development standpoint, because there may not be enough community support or the cost. There might be different reasons why a project may not be feasible in an area at the substation where, at the location where there is headroom, transmission headroom. So it'll be good to have some sort of like cross-reference with Q or anything else that would confirm the renewable interest as well for the resource potential.
That's an excellent point. And I think we totally agree. We have a lot of good information from the queue, from the supply curve about what are folks developing as real projects or real interconnection points, but also where in the GIS analysis and the other siting analysis, where are there feasible locations to actually develop these? So that's certainly something we're thinking about. It'll be really important as we move through our siting methodology, because there's kind of two questions there. One is there anything we need to do in the capacity expansion phase to avoid those concerns? I think we've done most, if not all, of what we could do in the capacity expansion phase by incorporating a county level GIS based supply curve. But then there's that second problem of if we have selected, like, quote unquote, the reasonable amount of megawatts, actually citing them at specific nodes, that's where you have to take that extra step and you need to use more information. Did someone from the JU want to speak briefly about, any thoughts you currently have about citing methodology in addressing that question?
Hey, Skylar, this is Jeff Marr from National Grid. We haven't put together the full plan yet. Obviously we're a few months out from actually building the nodal power flow cases. Right now, we're thinking that we're going to try to leverage what's in the queue as long as the generation has reached a sufficient stage of development. We're not sure exactly where we're going to draw that line yet, but maybe like completed an SRIS would be a good indicator that the project is relatively feasible. So we may leverage those projects that have advanced a bit into the queue, and then after that, we think we would try to use headroom buses. So those buses that the JU have identified as potential generation addition locations within the headroom filings that we've done. We've called out specific locations. We would try to build generation at those headroom buses where the programs or where there is headroom testing is suggesting that there is headroom available. We would then use those buses. To the extent that you have to build even more generation beyond what's in the queue or what we have headroom for, I don't think we quite have a plan for that yet.
Citing, very important. We'll definitely keep that in mind. Yep.
Yeah, would there be any opportunity to, I know we are not in stage 2, but might be helpful to discuss this a little bit in more details and allow for more feedback on this citing methodology? Because I do think this is very critical to the modeling, to the results, to everything that is being done here, where you add kind of like this generation, especially you are assuming meeting the targets. So using headroom buses, if there is nothing in the queue, the question I'll have is like, okay, how much of those, like how much is, call it fictional versus real developments? And it can go in both ways, over optimizing or, under, yeah.
No, this is great. This is a great point. As Jeff just mentioned, this is a key part of development that's going to happen at the beginning of stage 2, most likely. I think, one of the things we had talked about was maybe having those extra meetings in January, even if we've already kind of kicked off the capacity expansion modeling. There might be additional things we want to discuss to aid in the EPPAC's kind of evaluation of the whole process moving forward. So there might be an opportunity to continue the discussion either via email through kind of reviewing a citing methodology, or a discussion in January about potential issues to avoid, just like you just went through. You listed 2 or 3 things that should be paid attention to as we're doing the citing methodology. If we could have something on paper or have a meeting up to talk through those things to make sure we're paying attention to them and can develop a accurate and representative citing methodology, I think that'll be helpful. So we'll keep this in mind and see what we think the best pathway should be. So I think that's something we can tentatively commit to. Let's try to see if there is an ability to review that citing methodology once it's developed, and maybe even have a meeting on it in January.
That would be great. Thank you, Skylar.
So a question came in the chat while we were talking, just clarifying the unidirectional versus bidirectional flows. I'm just asking, since we clarified CPNY was unidirectional, what about the Chippy line?
Hey, Skylar, this is Sarah Karkner again from the NICE. I think Jason had to drop off. But in regards to the Champlain Hudson line, I can double check, but I believe that that's also modeled as unidirectional to assume imported generation from HQ in our models.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, Raya.
Hello, thank you so much. This is really interesting as we're all trying to, I speak for us, wrap our heads around what are we trying to learn from these different scenarios. And I think that's in part to the discussion that happened before around citing methodology. Some of this scope implicates, or some of this implicates what is the scope for the distribution system? And there's a lot to think about and be clarified there. I think I just wanted to uplift the point as well. I'm absolutely interested. I mean, I get that we're looking at impact on the system, and yet we still are using a lower load assumption. While I want to see, us really learn at what we can, what type of investment we may be able to avoid through, DERs. I also just want to uplift that concerned about avoiding underinvestment, in transmission, how that, impacts distribution. I know our scope is sort of, we know that that's not our scope, but we know that it's implicated, especially in, high population centers and disadvantaged communities. I guess it's sort of a question is it's a comment and also a question is how can we just keep our eye on that metric or even get at that?
Right. I know one of the,
sorry, I know that folks, we'll have our load forecast, et cetera, but just wanting to, ensure that, that we don't underinvest where we know we're going to need, a lot of investment.
So it's Liz and Raya. Again, that's the needle that DPS is trying to thread here, is avoiding both insufficient transmission investment and overbuild of transmission. We're trying to avoid both of those outcomes, and as you can imagine, that's incredibly difficult to do. But your point's well taken. We want this modeling exercise to give us good information that will help us avoid both of those possibilities to the extent possible.
Yeah, and I guess my question is how does this scenario 2 get us to in answering that question about overbuild or underbuild?
Right. It's the kind of, as Liz said, threading the needle. I think one of the things in relation to what Bill said was this would be trying to test a scenario of not avoiding investments overall, but transitioning those investments from transmission poles and wires to DERs. And so it would kind of be showing that, we're not just assuming low demand, we're assuming investments have been made to increase load flexibility, possibly through the development of VPPs and energy efficiency and DER integration. So it's basically just identifying different investments that need to be made to enable that. We see lots of the assumptions that build our load forecasts are developed based on really aggressive assumptions of things like EV adoption and heat pump adoption that may not be happening today and might require their own investments to kind of jumpstart heat pump adoption and EV adoption as well. So it's kind of showing us these possible worlds, and we'll have to evaluate which of these things are happening on their own, which ones require their own investments. And then, I think the ultimate thing that we're looking for in this process, CGPP specifically, is, like Liz said, the transmission investment. But this is also one of the most comprehensive modeling frameworks that that I've ever been a part of, that I think has been done in New York, that may, even most places, not many places have done something this granular. So it should give us a lot of really good information just in general about priorities and how valuable it is to invest in those kind of lower voltage non-transmission things as well in scenario 2. So that's what I would be looking forward to it. Is there something else you think we would
Well,
want to know?
no, I see that. It's just that there's some tension in terms of chicken and egg. Like, we know we need these transmission investments in order to get to some of these DERs. And just what are we learning here that we aren't learning in the high transmission impact scenario, where we also, I think, want to answer those questions. Like those same questions we want to answer within the high transmission impact scenario. How can we utilize, and maximize DER? So I get it. I'm just, but I think I'm just still trying to fully get what we're learning here. That's unique in scenario 2. That isn't, in scenario 3, and why.
I definitely hear that. I think that's reminding me of something Julia was talking about earlier about are we inadvertently leaving beneficial things off the table in scenario 3, or are we not looking at the right things in scenario 2? I think the answer could kind of be yes to both of those things. We are leaving certain things off the table in scenario 3 because of this concept of bounding the future. So this is where we are trying to push a little farther outside of the central scenario, the central comfort zone, by enabling the commission to see what if DER doesn't show up quite as fast, or if the load profile isn't as managed as we hope, and try to kind of bundle those types of assumptions together. So I think you're right. We are in all of these scenarios trying to get a good sense of the value overall of things like DERs, of things like transmission investments, by comparing a wide range of scenarios. And some of them will not show up in all 3 scenarios.
And just hopefully we won't lose the both and, I guess.
Right. Well, don't let us. Don't let us.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. John, you have something you want to say?
No, I think you covered most of what I was going to add there, Skylar. I was just gonna, I think having those boundaries, is very important. You're trying to stretch the bounds of those potential futures so that you have an idea of what those set of solutions can look like. And you can learn a couple of different things from it. One, you can identify transmission that looks robust across all scenarios or amongst 2 of them. And that really helps guide, informing the commission about what some least regrets type investments might be. But also, as Skylar noted, it's helpful to have those boundaries as well, because as things evolve and we see the futures that we're going more towards, we have the information that can, guide what investments need to look like as we get more information. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that this is meant to be a cyclical process, right? So you're not going to identify all of the transmission needs that we need to achieve goals through 2050 right away in the first round necessarily. But that doesn't mean that there's not useful information that can be utilized to inform commission decisions about those investments. Again, as we continue to learn more about what's coming to pass from a policy, technology, et cetera, perspective going forward.
Can I just say, I hate that phrase, no regrets, because
I said least regrets. I would never say no regrets.
Wait, there's always regrets.
I can't drive home from the supermarket without regrets. So, you know, it doesn't mean a whole lot.
Not promising zero regrets. Okay, that's funny. Okay.
And Liz, if I can say this point because it's burning on my it's also like, I think we have to keep in mind that it's possibly 2 to 3 year process, at least this first one, and to build the transmission, it may take 5-7 years. So I think we also need to keep this aspect in mind, that transmission is very long lead time, as we have seen with the schedules for phase 2A upgrades.
Yeah, but to John Verniker's point, this is a repeating process.
The repeating part is really important. Also, you know, trying to find out that, you know, optimal. This is why we have these 3 scenarios, and trying to figure out what we think is optimal in all those scenarios, and kind of laying out in the report. This is going to be where it's really important to interpret these results in the future, because if we find out that, you know, DERs, for example, have a really high value, and these local system improvements might have a really high value to, oh, we're seeing something switch on your screen, Tom. I'm not sure if that's it on purpose. You know, if we see DERs are really high value, those are much faster to develop than transmission. And so, you know, we might see that we want to develop those, and so that gives us some more flexibility in timing. But if we end up figuring out 1 or 2 cycles later, like, oops, that didn't pan out as much, we need transmission, you know, the timeline might not work anymore. So that's kind of the balance we're trying to hit here of, you know, making sure we're analyzing all these scenarios and trying to figure out what that ideal outcome would be, and try to get as close as we can to that, while constantly updating it through all the cycles to make sure we're not losing sight of the timing issues throughout this whole process, because we are looking out to 2030, 2040. I think we're even hitting like 2042 in our last year in this 20-year modeling framework today, and every cycle we're going to be pushing that out 2, 3, 4 years at least. So definitely something to keep watching, and will be a lot of discussions in phase probably 5 and 6 about what those, you know, those values and those trade-offs are in terms of timing and value. I don't see any other hands up right now, but I wanted to circle back to one of the discussions I don't feel necessarily satisfied with about how we're viewing that quote unquote high amounts of DER and how that could be integrated. I think, you know, Bill raised a good point about the nonlinearity of the DER impact on, you know, the load, and then the transmission impact. Do we have a good sense of how we might go about, you know, solving that problem, or picking a number, or citing DER today? Like, do we have a good sense of, you know, either an answer to that question, or the steps we could take to feel better about that question moving forward? Like, what would we need to do to get more information about what number to pick or what sites to use for DER integration?
In terms of disaggregating the state level numbers, which then go to zonal and then go go to nodal, I could say we have some confidence, at least in the distribution load forecast, as an indicator of how to do that disaggregation, just because our utility specific distribution level forecasts generally take into account land availability, EQ, all the things that you'd want to look at for a DER forecast. What I will say is, so that's in locating the generation and disaggregating the forecast and treating DER as an input. What I will say would be a substantial challenge, and I might need help from some others to help describe how, is, you know, modifying the operation of DERs, trying to get at different profiles for individual DERs, particularly where we're looking at DER as an input to contain what this model is solving for. But I hope that helps you understand how we disaggregated, at least to get to, you know, what nameplate goes where.
Sure. Yeah, and I think moving a little bit beyond that, then, you know, that makes total sense. I think moving beyond that by one step is, if we do want to analyze a quote unquote very high DER or high local impact scenario, and we want to go say beyond a 10 gigawatt or whatever to a 12 gigawatt distributed solar, or beyond whatever fraction of storage we decide should be on the distribution network. If we decide to move beyond that, what's the decision-making process there? If we're trying to do quote unquote high DER, what do we consider high and how do we choose that? And do we follow the same method for siting after that, or do we need to kind of reconsider? And I know
Again,
we're
I'm
just
just
throwing
open
things
to
out there.
others' thoughts.
Yeah.
No, this is good because we need
On the
to,
fly.
this is what folks need to think about for the next 2 weeks because, right, like I said, we're going to come back with that second tab I flashed you a sneak peek of the really detailed assumption matrix. So getting into the weeds is important. I think in terms of how we commit levels, it's going to be treated as an input similar to load. So in that way, I would think at least when we're considering, so even if we're not comfortable just modifying load and having that sort of count as modifying both load and DER, at least having those conversations together since they have the same type of impact on transmission infrastructure. Picking for example, maybe a loading level that we're comfortable with and we want to move towards, and then helping figure out how that disaggregates into a DER impact versus how much are we trimming back electrification impact. And again, I would encourage folks where possible, this becomes a much easier conversation if you're familiar with already developed scenarios. Like, for example, I know CAC developed quite a number of them that hit at the levels that you're interested in, or have an interesting level that's maybe different from the state goals that we're modeling here. Those would be good to bring to the forefront as options for adoption here, at least as an input assumption. So not an answer to your question, but a consideration. Apologies.
Yeah, Tom, Bill Acker here. Just another quick follow-up question to that. Would it be reasonable to run a couple sensitivities on the load level? I mean, I realize it's harder if we're having to account for all the DERs, but if we did take your approach, at least from a sensitivity perspective, of them being equivalent, lower load being equivalent to the higher load plus DER, maybe we run one scenario which is the equivalent of the higher load plus DER, and then we have sensitivity or two on top of that vary the load level, that would then hopefully see this not only reality and also potentially give some comfort level to the fact that we know whatever we do know, we know the load level is going to be wrong. So having some very flexibility of that understanding would be helpful.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, that scenario versus sensitivity discussion coming up again, because I do think, that if we were just going to vary the load level by saying, let's reduce that load level by another 5% or 10%, you just shift the whole thing down. I think that might fit into the sensitivity framework just to test out those types of things. The one thing that popped into my head while I was thinking about that, though, was a lot of the DER, for example, the local resources we would use to make an impact on the peak load, they don't just shift the whole peak load down. They actually shift the energy to different times, like storage or flexibility. You don't just shift the whole load shape down, you actually change the load shape, and that might be, a little trickier to analyze. In terms of like just creating a sensitivity to run. Although we might be able to do some simplified assumption about, just kind of chopping off peak and putting it, somewhere else, that amount of energy somewhere else on the load shape, and that might be able to qualify, but just another thing to keep in mind about whether we're changing the kind of load level, just like shifting up and down versus actually changing the load shape. But I agree. This is seems ripe for assessment somehow, whether it's beforehand or during the process, just to make sure we're not missing something key about DER impacts here because of that nonlinearity. I think one of the ways we could implement this is by changing the fraction of the resources that are transmission sited versus distribution sited, especially with things like solar and energy storage. Those are things we can use siting to help with to try to avoid those transmission needs by siting them more on the distribution network. There's also the chance just to, off the bat, adjust that load forecast to be a more representative one that basically takes into account those DERs ahead of time. So that's something we'll have to talk more about moving forward. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, how about any more questions for the JU? I can give another 20 seconds to see if any other hands come up or any other topics come up. But we do have about a little over 25 minutes left, so I was going to share one more thing briefly if there's no more questions. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen briefly. Something that we had talked about probably 2 meetings ago at this point was kind of trying to get more of a sense of where the EPPAC is going to fit in moving forward in terms of touch points and the availability to review content. So I whipped up a couple of points to throw on the timeline that we've posted online, just to give folks a sense of how it might pan out. I just want to get some thoughts. This is not final. This is just something I threw together over the last few days to get a sense of where the potential touch points could be for the EPPAC throughout the rest of the CGP process. I used the other timeline and just added a new blue circle for EPPAC touch points. And you can see there's actually quite a few of them if we kind of do all the things that folks had suggested over the last few meetings. I'm not sure if you can see the cursor or anything, but over here on the left side of things is where we are today in between October and January, generating the scenario assumptions, reviewing the citing methods. So that's something we had already discussed about, something that was brought by Rodika earlier. About wanting to make sure we're reviewing those citing methodologies and trying to come up with these other scenarios. Once the modeling begins in stage 1 in January, there might be a few weeks before we're getting preliminary results or getting any of that feedback, but there is some time in between that, between January and April, or between April and July, where there will be more preliminary results that the EPPAC will probably be able to review. And this is going to be an important stage to make sure that the scenarios we're developing now, make sure they're actually panning out and giving us the information we were thinking we could get, not necessarily the answers, we don't know what the answers are, but make sure the model is representing the assumptions we wanted to make accurately. This arrow down here going to this bottom section is related to the piece of the order that says, the EPPAC is going to give input and guidance on whether any of these scenarios show the need to potentially run some bulk transmission sensitivities, relaxing some of those constraints. So that's something to keep in mind. This arrow is going to potentially be important somewhere here in stage 1 as we start getting those results. We need to review them and figure out if we need to run any of those sensitivities. All the way here in the bottom left, I've noted, another important piece that the order gave the EPPAC, which is to make sure this whole time, that's why there's an arrow connecting it all the way to the end. This entire time we're collecting lessons learned, because, this is the first cycle. We're not pretending like we've already laid out a perfect 2 or 3 year process. In fact, we already know, like in the order, we've already requested the JU to file recommendations for condensing this. So we're trying to collect lessons learned. So everyone, if you're able to, keep this in mind, take some notes, send them over to me or the EPPAC email address, and we want to collect those lessons learned as we go. This could be anything from process to modeling to anything that you think that we could have done better. Tell me I talk too much on EPPAC meetings. That would be helpful input as well. Anything we can put on either the mid-cycle report or incorporate into the final report that we could potentially take action on in this cycle or in future cycles. That'll be really important as we go. The order did not specifically lay out anything in stage 2 through 4 where it said, we definitely need the EPPAC to do X, Y, Z, but it said as the DPS team and the JU team move forward, there may be other instances where input from the EPPAC might be important. And I've kind of listed some of them here. One is with that citing methodology, you know, it is obviously very, very important. And it's one thing to discuss it early on and kind of come up with a method you think might work. Then we have to kind of incorporate that into the model and make sure that the steps that we've taken actually give results that are reasonable, realistic, and match what we were hoping to come out of that. So that might be another touch point at some point. I didn't exactly know where to put that circle, but sometime in stage 2 and 3, where that reviewing the citing methodology might be really important, as well as at the end of stage 3 or somewhere in stage 3 and 4, where it may make sense to have the EPPAC review information related to the local assessments and some of those initial proposed solutions, especially as they relate to the integration with stage 5, which was explicitly called out in the order, related to the least cost planning, aggregating everything back into the modeling framework again in stage 5. It would probably be helpful for you all to be integrated a little bit in stage 3 and 4 at the very least, to make sure that you're set up well to give that input in stage 5. And then obviously stage 5, serving in a very similar role you're serving in now, and reviewing those draft results and asking questions, and then reviewing the final report and providing that those comments as well. So this is just kind of a draft touch points. On any or all of these could move around a little bit. Don't take anything too specific about where the circles are dropped. They literally just, you can tell, drop most of these on just lines or in random places, trying to give a general sense of where I thought it might make sense. But I'd like to, if folks have comments on this, we could take some now, or we could, get some feedback via email about what you think makes sense about more or fewer touch points, or what pieces of these touch points you think are most important, so we can remember to kind of keep folks engaged with this.
Or Skylar, or where they should go.
Or where they should go. Yes, exactly. Thank you. So I'm presenting now, so I lost the ability to see any hands. So if anybody has a hand up, Liz, could you maybe call on them if they have a hand up?
I think Rodica has a hand up, but I don't know if it's on this or something else. Rodica?
Yes, it's on this. This is very helpful. Thank you, Skylar. I have a comment question on the guidance on the need for bulk transmission sensitivities. It may be just high level on this bulk component. Is the idea that if there are some potential for bulk solutions or bulk upgrades, they will be reevaluated in stage 5 and 6, and based on the commission decision after that, this may become a PPTN, or is there, or is the consideration different here, being a CGPP process?
No, I think, Liz, did you want to take that one? I think we were
try.
planning on those. Yeah, those were
I'll try.
planning to flow through. Yeah.
Yeah, so the commission established a mechanism whereby bulk transmission solutions or the potential for a bulk transmission need could be evaluated. I think Skylar is suggesting that it would be appropriate to have EPPAC comment on that. The specifics are that DPS with NYSERDA support will hire a consultant to develop, I think we use the term conceptual bulk solutions. And we're still kind of working through what that means, but the consultant in parallel with the rest of CGPP would be working on the conceptual bulk solution, its rough costs, and I'm speaking very, very rough costs, most likely, so that at the end of the process, the commission would have the benefit of all of the, all the utilities work plus the consultants' work. And yes, if the commission decided that that there was that the evidence suggested a transmission need, then the commission would initiate a PPTN. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I'm just wondering how that impacts the current PPTN or the upcoming PPTN in 2025.
It doesn't. It's an additional mechanism for identifying public policy transmission needs.
And like for the record, I'm representing AC New York. AC New York is agnostic to what the solution is, to what who is going to end up building it. But some of the concerns we have been expressing over time as well is how can we ensure that we optimize the system, and that may be a mix of bulk and local.
Yeah.
And maybe one helpful discussion could be around those assessments, bulk assessment and local assessment, what the scope is. Can a local, how do we see this? Like if you have low voltage constraints, several in the same area, can utilities look at the bulk component themselves? At the end, it's optimizing and kind of like maximizing bulk transmission headroom and optimizing the cost.
We're certainly aiming for a good understanding of the value of local and the value of potential bulk solutions. Maybe we should, defer more detailed discussion when we get a little closer. There's discussion on this issue in the order. Unless, somebody else, John or Skylar wants to jump in.
No, I was just going to refer to what you just said there, Liz, about in the CGP stage 5, we'll be looking at more of the local options, and if in parallel and on the same time frame, we want to be looking at the scope of the conceptual bulk solution. So we'll have both options to look at and how they might either work together or choose one or the other. So that's something we're hoping to, have both pieces of information. If you think there's another way that those can be even more integrated somehow, that'll give us even better ways to compare and contrast and find the optimal solution, and just feel free to provide us with that feedback. That'd be great.
We broke a lot of brain cells trying to get this.
Yeah.
So yeah. If you have a better idea, a better mousetrap, please. Anyway.
But from my standpoint, it's just the would be helpful, and maybe you'll hear me less, talking less if the scope is clarified, like what is to be looked as bulk solutions versus local solutions.
I think, again, John or Skylar, what will be looked at is going to depend on some of the early results of phase 1. This is not going to be an open invitation like the way the NISO process works for people to suggest public policy needs. It's the assessment will be based on what we're learning in this process. Does that help?
I want to add something to that too, Liz, because I think some of it's a little bit of perhaps a semantic distinction, right? So this optional bulk solution assessment process that was established in the order is really focused on sort of those interzonal constraints and the potential for bulk solutions to alleviate them. Not like looking just at a particular voltage class. And Radhika, you may or may not have intended this when you were asking about what the utilities could consider in their local assessments. But I think if you're asking, could they be considering, higher voltage level solutions to potentially alleviate multiple lower voltage level solutions within a given geographic area, I don't think I think the answer is that, similar to the way they've done in some other assessments, that the utilities, yes, they could look at, for example, a 345 kV solution within their service territory, right? It's just when we're saying bulk here, we really mean that interzonal transfer capability increase, not above 200 kV necessarily.
Right. Yeah. No, thanks for that, John. That's an important point.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our goal is not to make you talk less, Radhika. You can talk as much as you need to.
But was there another hand up? I'm not sure.
Yes, Liz, it's mine. Yeah.
Randy.
Just got a question. I know there's a lot of well, it's always the case. There's a lot of happenings in the energy world of New York, but I would love to see a way that we can, and that's going to happen like during this 24 to 26 period. So it would be really great if we have a way to like iterate some of that process, like the assumptions in the start, because would wouldn't be nice to like get towards the end and then be like, oh well, some of our assumptions have changed and some of those are going to be major assumptions, and then have to go back and redo that. So if there's a way that we could show that, along some of the stages we're going back and just looking whether or not an assumption is valid still, and then if it's not, then going back and then reiterating the process might be a good thing to put in there.
No, I definitely hear you. I think that also caused a lot of stressed brain cells earlier in these phases, trying to figure out how this process is going to work, especially when there's literally like a year and a half at least between stage one, where we're doing this assumption building, and a final report. So that's good to bring up. Although I'm not sure how much we can promise at the moment, based on uh, exactly what you mentioned. If things are constantly changing through this process, we have lockdown, assumption lockdowns for a reason, because we wouldn't be able to finish a process without locking it down. Just ask the NISO. They have a million people pulling them a million directions all the time, and they're always very clear about having to have those lockdowns of assumptions so they can at least keep moving forward and fix things in either interim steps or in future stages. So we're going to have to take probably a similar approach here, where after a certain time period in the stage one modeling, that those scenarios are probably going to have to be locked down, so we don't get into like an infinite modeling loop here. But I also hear some of the feedback about some other key assumptions that might arise with regard to either specific projects or specific policies. And if there are ways to incorporate those without invalidating the process or invalidating those results, and so we can keep moving forward, I could see having that discussion. So, keep in mind what you think might be changing, keep raising those things about what you think is really important that might have changed during this process, so we can all discuss what the best way to approach it is. As we move through this cycle, we're all doing this for the first time, and we're going to try to be as efficient as possible, but it's already going to be, this massive lift of almost 2 straight years of modeling and everything. So I'm hesitant to, commit to any major updates to the modeling mid-cycle, but definitely something to keep in mind and try to build in any way we can, so you're presenting valid results at the end. Not sure if anybody else has any other feedback there, but that was just my thoughts.
Well, it's Liz, and just, reasonably uninformed spectator perspective is that's sort of the reason why we think about this as a bounding kind of exercise, trying to grapple with significant uncertainties in the best way we know how.
Mhm. Yeah. Any other feedback on this kind of, I guess I would call it like a straw proposal for the EPPAC integration?
Skylar, I like your suggestion that there might be good ways, particularly in the middle stages, like 2 and 3, where the experts, the modeling experts on this phone, every call is a choice between them doing more modeling and doing a call. So if there are good methods we can utilize to, not saying we don't do meetings, I think these are fruitful, but to do offline communication for some of the stuff that's maybe more appropriate or suited for that would be a good way to expedite the process.
I agree, Tom. When we're talking about, especially those kind of initial results, it's probably less effective to try to sit everybody down in front of a spreadsheet for 2 hours and try to talk through everything that pops into your head. It's probably more valuable to try to coordinate that offline and, send results, ask for feedback, and try to, have calls once we've thought through some of the things that we see, to try to make best use of that in-person time. So the integration of the EPPAC in future stages may look different than this kind of standing meeting, where we know we're going to have things to talk about every 2 weeks, whether there's something in front of us or not. So that's definitely good feedback, Tom. Is there any other hands up?
My hand's up.
Oh, go for it.
I don't want to speak out of turn. It's Ryan. Thank you so much. I a couple comments that might, well, may or may not be out of the scope of this particular document, but I just wanted to make sure that we keep in mind a few of the other sort of parallel things that are happening as required by the CLCPA to, as part of its implementation framework. And one of those is that I've got my eye on is the comprehensive review that the commission needs to do in 2024 around sort of actions to implement the CLCPA. And then there are some other important like 2 and 4 year guidelines that this process will implicate, so that and I'm sure this is something that you're thinking about, but that somehow this body will need to tell, make sure that some of this thinking or this process is somehow represented in that comprehensive review that the commission is supposed to do next year. And the other thing I'll mention, again, I get this document is very tight, but it would be good at some point if we could think about what are the opportunities to create more space for public comment or other ways to engage diverse stakeholders.
Yeah, on that second one, Raya, I think there's a directive in the order to do at least one. I can't remember exactly, but there's a directive in the order relating to broader public communication about this process, and we are going to work on scheduling that. I think it's a bit too soon, but that's definitely on our dashboard.
Awesome. And I presume also on the dashboard is thinking about the 2024 comprehensive review or figuring out how.
It's not on my personal dashboard, but it's on other people's. Yes.
Is that you're talking about the CEF the review?
Well, just that the CLCPA and it yeah, definitely requires a lot of things, but one of them is a comprehensive review by the commission in 2024 on all of its actions to implement the CLCPA. It's just part of the CLCPA's implementation framework, because you've got other things that other agencies are also reviewing, and they come together in like the Climate Action Council reconvening and the Climate Justice Working Group reconvening. So it's just something that I think this body is going to want to be sure that it's representing, at the very least, the actions that are being taken or summarized, or how this will impact that process in 2024.
Yeah, I think we have to park that one. I don't know exactly how how these things interact. I know we are committed to doing the review. I don't know, but I'm not directly involved in it, so I can't really respond to your question.
One of the ways that we've had, coordination come up in the past is on things like this, the specific calendar of events. We're trying to, we have this June filing for a mid-cycle assessment with DPS staff, and one of the things we're trying to think about through there is how it coordinates in terms of timing for other people to participate in this, when the reports come out versus, when we get data versus when the NISO is doing things and when NYSERDA might be doing things, because that coordination of all the programs and other policies and other stakeholders is a big deal. And if we can get on one of the key items was if we can get on a similar timeline as NISO planning, that could be a huge, boost to the process, huge efficiency gain potentially. Another thing was making sure we're not overburdening stakeholders at any given phase, and we're being thoughtful about when we're scheduling technical conferences, those types of things. But there might be other engagements and other things we need to keep on our radar to make sure we're staying consistent. So we'll keep that in mind.
Thank you so much. I appreciate, as much as an advocate who, running between proceedings, and
right.
And I know this is such a huge lift for staff and all of the agencies, as we've got this these sprawling directives at the CLCPA and all of its planning directives that are supposed to kind of all, together kind of pull towards these big goals. So thank you very much for that, all of you.
Are there any other hand raised?
I don't think I see any. So just to reiterate maybe what you said, Skylar, it'd be helpful to have people's thoughts about where to place these additional touch points. Maybe by the next time we meet. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that would be great. If you, I'm thinking about maybe just shooting this by email. I don't necessarily want to post this online yet because it's not final, but we could share this maybe over email and get folks' thoughts on this so we can maybe get something a little bit more final as kind of like our group ideas for how this integration actually works, and we can post that to the EPPAC website once we've agreed on that. Because I think it would be helpful for other folks to see how this engagement is working and can kind of set a precedent for us to react to moving forward in future cycles.
Hey, Skylar, this is Radha Surya. Sorry for a last minute question. I think in the past I have asked for a process map looking at this diagram being, it's getting populated quite a bit, right? How can we draw lines
Yeah. Yeah.
on the handshake so that it would be much more easier to interpret? That's what I was thinking. Any suggestion on that?
Yeah, if this is too bungled for people to really see and think through very well, I totally understand. We can think through ways to get people doing other things than drawing circles on PDFs. People that are not going to be me, but ways to think of other people with skills to actually put something like this together. If folks want, maybe we probably would want to do that anyway for a more kind of like professional, final, formal EPPAC engagement type of document eventually, so we can definitely look into that. And maybe that's something that since the JU did put this map, the underlying map together that looks much nicer than what I've done to it, maybe we can get them to update it once we've kind of agreed on where circles actually go.
Sounds good,
I
Skylar,
think that's a
and
good
happy to
suggestion.
help. Thank you, and happy to help in any way on
Oh, thank you.
developing the process map. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate all the great conversation today. If there's no additional hands right now, I think we can wrap for this time, and we'll continue the development, have the JU continue the development of those two scenario matrices, trying to come up with, based on the feedback today, some more granular data options and maybe even some numbers on what those, for example, loads look like, and come back in 2 weeks. I know it's going to be tough for folks coming back on that Monday. So please, reach out if that's going to be an issue. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I think, is the next meeting. But we're planning on coming back that day to have another discussion of the specific scenarios and how to actually do that implementation. And look forward to continuing the conversation with folks in a couple weeks. Feel free to reach out to that EPPAC email address with any questions also.
Yep, and I'll reiterate, thanks to everybody for coming together. Look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, thanks for all your time. Have a great rest of your week.
So long.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.